get started, and thank you all for coming to this presentation to better inform all of us about the challenges of protecting the watershed. I want to introduce the commissioners and things. First, we have Cindy Parks and Rick Weston, the lefty replacement, Bob Finucane, and Natalie Sherman. Yeah, Sherman isn't here yet. We have Tom Leeds, our manager, here. And we also have in the audience our water and sewer operators, Kenny Ryan, operates the water plants, along with Grant Cracken and the wastewater guys, Matt Jones there, and Tony, all right, there. So we're here to presentation. I'm going to have Rick. We have a facilitator for the meeting for questions and directing those. So you want to introduce facilitator Rick?
Thanks, Skip, and thanks all of you for coming. We really appreciate this. This is, as we said, and all of you online, I hope you can hear me. This is, of course, an informational session. We're trying to better... Recording in progress. Trying to better inform ourselves and begin a thoughtful dialogue on how we address challenges that we're currently facing and may in future face with the watershed. To help us through tonight and our next meeting, which we're going to have a series of these, and the second one we've said will happen in January. It's likely to happen in February. Just given the holidays and some other challenges, we'll probably put it off a month. I'd like to introduce David Mears, who will be facilitating the discussion tonight. David is the former commissioner of the Department of Environmental Conservation. He is a private lawyer now, but also teaches at Vermont Law School, Harvard Extension, and the Vermont State University. He's an old friend, and I really am really happy. We're all really happy that he could be here to help us with this. So with that, David,
you want to give us some structure here, David?
Yeah, let me just kind of give a rundown of what I'm thinking will happen. I think that the board hired me because they wanted to protect themselves from you, but as I look out at you, I'm thinking maybe it's the other way around. But I know this is an important topic for the community. I know that the board has made what was a challenging decision for them to close off access for recreation to the surface water protection area, and there's been conversation that has generated. I know this community has a long history of civil discourse around these discussions. I just kind of want to just say, as a longtime public official in various places, I have been part of many conversations like this, most often required by a statute, a public notice and comment kind of period, and it can feel kind of rote, like it's just people going through the motions. I just want to acknowledge a couple of things. One, this is not required. This board has chosen to do this because they recognize that this is a conversation that they want to learn more about and they want to get broad community engagement on. And secondly, that in the conversations I've had with them, it's become very clear to me that they have not made up their minds on what the ultimate resolution of this issue should be. And they're very interested in educating themselves and learning with you and from you. So that's kind of the spirit of this conversation. Tonight's conversation will feel, I think, more like a lecture than it does a conversation. But my goal is to try to help, make it more conversational. I've asked each of the speakers tonight to make sure they leave enough time for questions. But in future conversations, we'll structure this in a way that will create more opportunities for dialogue and discussion. And of course, there's going to be plenty of opportunities in between now and the next information session and after that, before a decision is made, for folks to give input. So you see there's cards that have been left on your seats. As you're listening, if you have a question that comes up, make sure to write it down. If we can, we'll invite those questions during the evening. but it's very likely we won't get to all of them. So there's a box in the back wrapped in red tissue paper that you can drop your questions in, and we'll make sure that we get to them at some point in this dialogue. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Skip to talk a little bit about the history of the facility and the drinking water system.
Yes, thank you, David. We thought we'd start with a little bit of a history of the water system and some of the challenges we've been through in the past. Contamination of our water supply is no stranger to Waterbury, as you'll see in things, and how wise a choice that the fathers of Waterbury in 1895 did in selecting the source that he did. Can I run this by?
Yes.
Okay. I titled it The Drinking Water in Waterbury. And we're going to start with what the Edward Farrar Utility District is. And it was formed on July 1st, 2018. It's a municipality with limited authority to construct, manage, and operate water and wastewater systems. We have a charter that the legislature passed, and it's run by 5 commissioners, and we hire staff and things to manage the utilities and things. It has boundaries, can hold property, and holds elections with the registered voters and things. It was created when the village voted to dissolve and after failed mergers and things. And it was named Edward Farrar, who was an early citizen of Waterbury, and he died in a cave-in on October 14th, 1904, at the head of Elm Street and South Main Street. So hundreds of cars drive over the place that he passed away and things, and we named it the Edward Farrar Utility District in memory of his service. We put a plaque on his gravestone. He's buried in Hope Cemetery. And the purpose, as David and Rick have explained, is to provide information to the board going forward and what our options are in terms of managing the protection of the water supply in the watershed. I think this water system that they picked 6 miles from Waterbury is the 3rd most important event in the history of Waterbury, besides Partridge Thatcher founded it and our first settler, when those voters voted in 1895 to construct this water system 6 miles away. The cost was $32,000 at that day. It's $1.2 million today. And protecting the water supply, public water systems are defined as critical infrastructure under the U.S. Patriot Act of 2001. And its program is administered by the Federal Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And only a couple months ago, Kenny and the staff at the water plant were visited by 2 FBI guys checking out the cybersecurity at the plant. So it's a real risk that they're looking for. Before 1895, the village had 2 small systems, one up on Perry Hill. They served about 100 systems, and the growth of the village at that time needed a bigger water system, and there was a big need for fire protection. They really wanted hydrants and things, had a study committee and studied all those small streams around Waterbury. They even looked at Crossett Brook at Duxbury, and they settled on these springs and streams up in Stowe. They purchased the land that we own today, and the deciding factor to go up there was they had a spring that they found that was generating 150 gallons a minute. It was a big factor in their decision to go up there. So the village voter approved this system that had about under 500,000 gallon storage tank. It was a pond at the time on Blush Hill that provides 100 pounds pressure on the water system. It's a good design. It's still functioning today. And one interesting fact, it was constructed by Italian immigrants who dug a trench all the way from Barnes Hill to Waterbury, all by hand in those days. And 32,000 is 1.2 million. And they had a design of 225,000 gallons at that time. This is a map, Waterbury, showing this original line that we use today, the source on Barnes Hill, and the pipe. They actually had to dig 2 trenches much of the way because they put in 2 4-inch pipes to blow off the pressure coming off Barnes Hill. And down at the park, which is our park well, which you'll hear about in a minute, you can stand there and you can see the top of Hunger Mountain, which is where the water, when it falls as precipitation, comes down the mountain. And that's the water and coming out of your faucets and things. This is a map I was the 1958 survey map of the watershed. This is a Google Earth map of the watershed. This is the outline of the property that we own. It's about 500 acres. There's the Stowe Waterbury town line. This is the Waterbury Waterworks Road and the Barnes Hill Road. And these are the streams coming off the mountain. And we have dams there and there. And they've located some springs that are connected into the system. It's another Google Earth photo, same outline of the property. And here's the glider landing strip of Steve Freed's that he used to use. I don't know that it's used today. And here's the Sweets well field that we purchased in 92, where there's wells and things on that I'll talk about. But that water system was built in 1895. In 1936, they had a severe drought and things that they needed more water. They hired this New England company called Lade Boiler that's to come up and try to find them a groundwater source. And they did 30 test wells all around the village looking for a water supply. And only in 2 spots did they find an adequate source and quantity. And one of those happened to be the Rusty Parker Park that they had just purchased from the Central Vermont Railroad. And the gravel pack well that they put in had a design of 200,000 gallons a day. And the pump was up here on the 2nd floor. They put it in above the 27-year flood. So that, and you know, we used that system when there was a drought, pumping water into the mains. Along came July of 1988, which was my first year as a water commissioner and Bill Sheplin's first year as a manager. And that summer there was a drought again and we needed to turn on the park well. It hadn't been used in 17 years. So we turned it on and the first sample we took from it was contaminated with benzene, which is evidence of gasoline contamination. We had to issue a boil water order to reduce benzene below safe levels and then turned the pump off and went to one at Demerits. And further testing of that park well confirmed the level of benzene and it was contaminated. We found it was contaminated by the Anderson concrete plant across the track from the train station, constructed in the late 50s to produce concrete for construction of the interstate. The park well is there, and they had gas pumps that spills and things from that property contaminated the park well. So then we hired an engineer to look for additional sources that were safe. We went back up on Hunger Mountain there where our original supply was. We took an option on 35 acres from Linwood, Jack Sweet at the time. And we found 4 wells to produce groundwater. And in January of 1990, the village had a bond vote of $4 million and $3.4 million grants. So a $7.959 million project, which is $19 million today. So that's an example of the investment we have in the current system. This is the plant constructed on Barnes Hill, the water treatment plant dedicated to Earl Town, who was a longtime water department employee. This is what the treatment plant on Barnes Hill involves, you know, a Trident filtration system, multimedia, and has added chemicals to flocculate and takes out turbidity, bacteria, viruses, and parasites and odor, organics and things. We have a 700,000 gallon clear well that floats on top of the system and helps provide fire protection and things. This is our operators, Kenny, Kyle Diet, who isn't here tonight, and Grant McGacken in the plant next to the filters. This is the Sweets field that we purchased and drilled 3 wells. Later on, we also had a company construct a solar array on the property that generates electricity from the sun that we get income from. Here's that same property, the 3 wells that we drilled, 500 feet deep, 380 and 453, and these are the gallons per minute that they produce. That's a picture of the solar panel looking at Mount Mansfield there. We also had one other well drilled. We drilled it right over the where this 150 gallon spring was in 1895. We drilled it down to 600 feet and it yields 325 gallons a minute. We drilled an 8-inch well. We should have drilled a 10 because we could only get a pump big enough to get 325 gallons out from that depth. This is some of the early signs that were in the watershed, posted for quite a few years. Watershed protection area. No disposal of trash, no swimming, no trail building, no camping, no motorized vehicle, cutting or damaged trees or plants. Please respect the land. So those signs were up when these unauthorized trails were actually constructed in the watershed. This is Forested Parks map. I'm colorblind. I'm not sure if this is red or orange, but that's the state property. This is EFUD's property that we own in Curly, the water supply. And all of these are the unauthorized trails that have been constructed on the property. It's estimated by the Forested Parks folks, it's about 10 miles of trails. And this is an unauthorized trail starting on EFUD property and goes off onto state property up to the top of the ridge there. This is another map of that same area, courtesy of Dana Allen, that shows the trails and the streams. So you can see the number of crisscrossing trails there. I'm not sure what the colors are, which they may be an indication of the difficulty of the trails to riders. So there's 3 areas. There's Spotty Eggs area, the middle something area there, and then the Ranger. Yeah. So this is a blow up of the sportage. You can see the number of trails that crisscross. Our dam for an intake is there and up there. This is the other area, Rumperville. I couldn't read there. So this trail starts on EFUD, goes up off state land, and then over onto private property. And these are 3 signs that we put up more recently. indicating that protect our watershed, the Edward Farrar utility district. And this is the most recent sign we put up when we decided we needed to close the trails at least temporarily while we evaluated the options and educated ourselves on the options. And this is another one that we put up about the Edward Farrar Utility District Public Water Supply Area. These are a couple of historic signs that are Woody's collection that the former commissioners put up. Keep out the watershed, $25 reward if you're found doing there. And this one was the Rusty Parker Park, although it didn't have the name at that time. No playing of baseball or football in this park. I don't know if that was to protect the well or to protect the balls from going on the neighbor's property, but anyway. That concludes the presentation on the history of the water system and some of the issues that we've been through with contamination and being required to find a new source. And I'll turn it back over to David to facilitate any questions. We'd be glad to answer them.
All right, Skip, gold star for doing that officially.
Did I get under the 15 minutes?
Yeah, that was terrific.
I don't think so,
Pretty good.
Great job.
This is a great chat. What a treasure to have Skip in your community. Someone who's got kind of such a depth of knowledge of the history of the place. Questions for him or information that you have that you think he should add to the next slideshow? Yeah, please.
Will the slideshow, the PowerPoint be available online?
Yes. All the slideshows will be available on the EFUD website.
And my other question was, I'm not sure looking at the maps because I looked at them so fast, is there a distinction between the little single track bike trails and the very, very old, they were there when I first moved to Stowe in 1979, old, like they look like old logging roads or that kind of thing. The mountain bikers don't usually use those anymore. They use their little single track things. And I just wondered, some of that map looked like some of those trails were actually the old roads as opposed to the mountain bike roads. Is there a distinction in how you look at those?
They were those roads for logging operations that had been conducted in the past, and we conducted some logging operations. We have a forester, Tom and Dan Sweet are foresters, and they had a forest management plan of the property and things, and that was, some of the roads they used to get the timber out.
Right, that's what I figured, but they've been there for many, many years, not as recent. And,
Yes.
and they're very differently used. I think they're mostly used by hikers like me.
Right. Yeah, which is kind of embedded in your question is maybe the commissioner should think about treating those differently than, have a distinction between different types of trails and different recreation. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah, please.
When was that logging done? Just curious. When was that done?
The real historian is Woody, who is not able to be here tonight, but the early logging was probably done in the 50s, in 1950s. And then we did some logging later on, probably in the 1990s. Forester, they said it was to harvest some timber.
I think like 93 to 97, we have 3 different contracts.
I should have turned actually to this group first. Do you all have any questions for Skip on?
They aren't allowed that.
Yeah, go ahead, Cindy.
So Skip, does the EFUD charter allow us to spend developing the watershed for recreational use?
No, I don't think so, that we could spend the money only on the water and sewer system and things. I think spending money to promote recreation would be a big stretch that I don't think it's allowed under our charter. That creating a mountain bike park wouldn't be something that we could legitimately
justify. So,
Is everyone familiar with the concept of charters for municipalities? Or- Everyone gets that? All right, I won't. I was gonna put my law professor hat on for a second. Sounds like I don't need to do that.
I'm sorry. One thing I wanted to mention is that there is an email, a dedicated email address that you can use to raise questions, send them to us, and we will collect them. It's waterworks@waterburyvt.com. If you have any questions, you can write directly to this.
It
and-
rejects my emails every time.
Oh,
It still does. I tried it again this afternoon.
really?
After talking, emailing Tom.
Well, apparently we don't let anybody from Stowe.
It's a yahoo.com. I don't know.
Well, then-
I'm just warning people that, you may need to work on it.
if there are, yeah, we'll take,
Thank you.
thank you very much.
Sorry to
In
hear
the
that.
meantime, you can write us directly or through Tom. Thank you.
It works, it only doesn't work with Yahoo.
Ah,
And
so maybe.
my IT consultant tells me Yahoo's just really an old platform. So Gmail, all those other things are fine.
Steve wanted to get in and then you? Yeah.
Good to know.
Yeah, so Skip, I was just looking for clarification. Is this parcel of land public land or is it considered private land?
It's for a specific purpose owned by EFA, so I don't think it's considered public land per se. It's not like the town owns it and it's public. So, I don't know, Bill may have a,
Yeah. It's land that's owned by a municipality, as Skip said, for private purpose. And I believe that the law for that type of land is fairly specific and it allows a little bit more regulatory actions by the commission. So, I mean, if you've got, and, we went through this, or Montpelier went through this with Berlin Pond, and it went all the way to the state Supreme Court, and, the decision was that it was available to use private public. But clearly there's land that municipalities own that have fences around them, and you can't enter those properties. The reservoir up on Blush Hill would be that way. And the water plant property is public, but, we have fences and don't let people in there. David's the lawyer, but,
if I may, David certainly can tell us what the difference is between what EFUD's land is vis-a-vis the Berlin Pond land. There are other issues there in ownership, I believe. I just, by way of analogy, there are a number of municipal electric utilities in this state who have these specific charters, limited use, limited purpose municipality charters, as EFUD does. I think it's fair to view our EFUD's watershed in the same way that one might view the land on which a substation or transformer is located for a municipal utility. It serves a ratepayer base, it's owned and managed by a utility, but it's not public land in that sense.
Yeah, there's a distinction between publicly owned land, which this is publicly owned, and publicly accessible land. And there's all sorts of gradations in between. Yeah, and the distinction with Montpelier and the Berlin Pond, which I was unfortunately in the thick of that whole dispute. Ben, were you there at the department when that was going on? Which was a difficult conversation, but it was a different statutory construct because that involved a natural water body, and there's a set of rules, state rules around accessing that are not in play in this particular circumstance. But you had a question.
The solar array in the sweet field, there's 3 wells around that. Does the water going through the solar array, is it within the wellhead area of those wells?
No, I think they're 200 feet around the well. Solar array is outside. Plus there's 100 or more feet of overburden where the wells are before you hit the lead.
that the well is grouted into. So there's very little likelihood that, the solar array water would get into the wells. We've, age dated those wells and it's over 30 years old. From the time it entered the ledge and fractures up on Mount Hunger before it was drawn out of the fractures in the well, so.
For the non-geologists in the room, Skip, when you talk about overlay, you're just talking about the amount of dirt and gravel and
Yeah.
whatever that's on top. So it's 100-foot deep well. Is that
Well,
right?
they're 400 and 500.
405, thank you. Got it.
That's where the surface up there is the surface of the old Lake Vermont and the glacial area. So,
Yes, please.
I got here a little, maybe this was addressed. Is the contamination noted in the wells or at the filtration plant? Where is it exactly being noticed?
well, there isn't contamination in the wells, but we're concerned about the number of people with turbidity and activities in the watershed getting into the surface water supplies that we.
You might be thinking about the contamination.
Because why? I mean, you just talked about, and I was at the hearings for the solar array, and the hydrologist there, you know, there was a question about what if one of the hydraulic machines they were using to install the solar array had a hydraulic fluid leak. And the hydrologist said, well, it's gonna take 130 years for the water on the surface to get down into those wells.
Right.
So my question is, if you're noticing contamination now, you've been mountain biking there for 20 years at the most, where's that contamination coming from? Why do you think it's, you know, mountain bikers?
Well, Ben will be talking in a minute kind of about the kind of general contaminant situation, but as far as I know, there is no contamination of the well. The concerns that have been expressed are about the potential for future contamination, primarily focused, as Skip said, on the surface water. But when Ben gets to this, he might be a good person to ask some more questions about the details.
He has time to think about his answer now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Is there like a breakdown of well water supply versus surface water supply? Like how much supply is being impacted by the trails? And does it matter how much?
I didn't quite hear the whole.
The question was, you know, since the system is served by both wells and surface water, what's the relative proportion between those two sources?
Well, when there's adequate surface water, usually it's 100% off the surface water going through the filtration plant. Because that goes by gravity and it's cheaper. You just have to buy the chemicals. When you run the wells, it's 3-phase power, but they're rotated on a basis so that we're sure they operate. And this summer, we used them a bit during the drought period when the surface water supplies weren't providing all the water and things, so.
So it sounds like the answer is it varies. Yeah.
I'll tell you
Right.
exactly for the last 3 years in about an hour.
Okay. That answers my question.
Great. Well, should we get to I think Ben, go
I
ahead.
got one question from
Oh, yes.
Morgan Perlman online.
Please go ahead.
Yes, thanks. Just following up on Cindy's very interesting question, open-ended about sort of the charter and to what extent, legally, it makes sense for IFA to or not to manage for recreation. I think, it's interesting because I don't think, a future possibility is that we might be advocating for is managing for a bike park, but rather EFUD is managing the recreation or could manage the recreation for the purposes of protecting the water responsibly, just like the construction of roads is not literally spelled out in the charter. It's just implied that that's consistent with managing for the protection of the water. I'm just wondering if that's sort of a possible interpretation for how recreation could coexist, logically, legally.
That might be a question for you all to ask the city attorney about.
Certainly.
Yeah, thanks, Morgan.
And in the public land, private land thing, I do want to mention that we pay property taxes. And so, I don't know of any public land with pay property taxes. maybe if you could talk Stowe out of charging us property tax, we'd have something to talk about. Anyway.
Thanks, Bob. Yes, in the back.
Just, perhaps if someone taking notes, I know this is, videotape, but just mention this is something to think about, right? If someone writing this down, I'm used to having minutes.
There will be minutes.
There will be minutes, but yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. All right, well, good. Well, I think, Ben, you're up next.
Thank you, Skip.
Thank you, Skip.
Folks want to come down and sit in front, I won't pick on you, I won't ask you questions, you're welcome to take a seat.
They're gonna show you, you need this.
I don't know. I think it's gonna be,
I'm happy to hand it off.
yeah, I bet. So we get this set up, I'm Ben Montross, I'm the drinking water program manager with the state, so I work with the DEC. I oversee the public drinking water program, and EFUD is a public drinking water system. So we oversee it. I'm gonna go through quite a bit, and I talk fast and I talk a lot, so I'm happy to answer questions as I go, or if we get too derailed, we'll have to wait until later.
And just point to me and I'll scroll.
Cool. I'm kind of coming in at this with just, not that I'm, want to speak above or beneath anybody, but I'm just trying to aim a little bit lower and just kind of build up a foundation for there. Because in my world, a lot of times people turn on the faucet, they get water, they turn it off, they're done. They don't really understand where it comes from and all the work that goes into it. I think I caught an important comment that Skip made with, oh, we had a well at the park that we pumped into the water main. That doesn't happen anymore. That is old school thinking where you put water into a main, maybe you dump some chlorine into it. This is a whole different world, highly regulated, highly technical. All right. So why are we here? Why do I have my job? Why does EFUD exist? Why is there a separate drinking water and wastewater or sewer system? And the number one purpose and reason is protection of public health. Job number one, protection of public health. So a good example of kind of modern public health protection. This is actually jolly old England. In about 1854, there was a cholera outbreak. This is one of the first key examples in modern history of sanitary engineering and sanitary design. And this is why water systems exist. This is why EFUD exists. So there was a Dr. John Snow who identified and did some heat mapping that there several people were dying in this area of London in 1854. 616 people ended up dying. So he did some heat mapping to see what was going on, and he realized that the density and the highest concentration of deaths were around this Broad Street pump. And when I say pump, I mean pump, right? So that's an example. That's not the actual pump. But back in these days, there was no water system and wastewater system. There was no flushing a toilet. There was no sanitary engineering to bring your clean, crisp water to your house. There was a pump and there was a gutter, or there was a pit in the bottom of your basement that was hand dug in the dirt. And water and wastewater should not ever kind of do this, and they were doing that. So in order to stop this deadly outbreak, the doc just took the handle off the pump and stopped the nasty cholera outbreak, because there was an issue with infected people disposing of waste in the area, seeping into the ground and being pulled out of the well. So that's what we're trying to avoid. I mean, we're way past that at this point, but this is the crux of why we're here and why these water systems exist. Slightly modernizing. You can see this graph is of life expectancy, and I'm sorry, it's blue on blue or purple on blue. Women live longer, they're the top line, men live a little shorter, they're the bottom line. And you can see basically the steepest part of this curve from, I think it's 790 to 2020, is that range right there between 1880 and 1920. This is what was called like the first sanitary public health revolution. In that window is when you started to see sanitary engineering. You started to see public drinking water systems being built. You started to see septic systems and sewer systems being built. You would see municipal trash pickup, things like that. Penicillin, polio vaccine, flu shots are all out over here outside of that range. So really, one of the most critical things to protect public health and the health of especially any area that people are kind of tightly packed is this public health revolution and that sanitary engineering. So what is a public drinking water system? There's 3 different types, and I'm trying to pick some local examples. We start at the bottom. Public drinking water system is any source or combination of sources of water that combine to serve at least 25 people for 60 days out of the year or more. An example of that is Little River State Park. People come and go. There's a lot of people. If something goes really wrong, we want to know what it is and we want to fix it or prevent it. But it's not the same people every day for 70 years, like would be if you lived in a community and you drank that water every day.
I'm sorry, for the people online, you appear to be sharing the wrong screen.
Hang on, sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Did that picture, can you now see the drinking water slide? It says, what is it, drinking water?
Yeah,
system?
somebody switched. We can see this now. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So Little River is the first one, basically really just critical things. If you drink the water now, you're going to get sick now. Next step up is what we call a non-transient, non-community system. If it serves 25 or more of the same people for at least 6 months. A good recent local example of that is the Copley Hospital, the Waterbury Clinic up on 100 by the Cabot Annex. There's like 49 employees up there. Those employees are there day in and day out exposed to that same water. So that health protection is higher. And then here, EFUD is the top level tier, is called the public community water system. That's what we're dealing with here. And we have in our database that there's a little over 1,000 connections. So 1,000 buildings, businesses, homes that are connected, and a population of give or take 6,000 people. All right, so a little bit of the why, a little bit of the what. Now we're going to dig into some of the how. There's kind of 2 converging trains that pile on top of EFUD with respect to public drinking water regulation, and that comes from both the federal regulations and the state regulations. So the federal regulations, there's acts of Congress, literally. There's federal rules, there's federal executive orders, all that sort of stuff we've seen in the news. All of that can be directed at a public drinking water system. So that can converge on the top, and then same with the bottom. The state has statutes and acts of the legislation. We have authority to generate rules. All of that converges on the EFUD, and either we take the state rules and implement them, we can take the federal rules and implement them, or the EPA can implement them directly. So there's a lot of pressure converging on public drinking water systems. This is a major oversimplification. I got a little thing about how a bill becomes a law from like Schoolhouse Rock. Way simplified. Just think, there's a lot of process, there's a lot of steps, there's a lot of people involved, and there's a lot of very heavy regulation. A handful of examples of this, just to get your head into this. An example of federal regulation that you probably heard about is the Flint, Michigan lead crisis. That is the federal lead and copper rule. That is a federal rule passed by Congress, regulated by EPA, that we actually took and said, we're going to take that nice federal rule, we're going to write that into state rule, and we're going to implement that. So that rule applies to every public drinking water system like EFUD across the country. Another example of a state rule. So we have our state technical standards. Folks remember, I don't remember what it was, 3, 4, 5 years ago when everything in Texas froze?
Yes.
All the water froze, and we were getting calls from Texas going, what do you do differently? It's like, we bury our pipes 6 to 8 feet in the ground because we have frost. Oh. You ever been somewhere warm and there's this little like bird cage on the ground and you see a pipe come up and go back down? We can't have that. That's a service connection. That's a meter pit. In Vermont, that's in your basement because it can't be above ground. So we have a state-specific technical standard because we have state-specific technical needs. So that's why we have our rules with all of those fun-filled parts and pieces. Next. So for federal rules, because it applies broadly and nationally, the EPA will go out and they'll kind of see what are the contaminants that we're concerned about? What are the chemicals, either man-made or naturally occurring? There are things in the ground that can create issues. There are things that we introduce to the water that can create issues. They see how far afield they are. They determine if there's a health risk and what those risks are. And then they set a standard. The big word for us is that their phrase is a maximum contaminant level. That's the standard. That's the bar that can't be exceeded with respect to water quality. Right now, there's over 90 of those. So when Skip says, oh, we cut the water, we pumped it into the main, that's why that doesn't happen anymore, because there's over 90 individual contaminants that are regulated. And in Vermont, it's closer to 100. We can be more stringent. We are more stringent in a handful of cases. So the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act, this is what started it all. This was started in 1974. And again, the purpose is to protect public health by regulating the nation's public drinking water supplies. EPA sets these national standards, like I said, either human introduced or naturally occurring. And it started really with the first regs in 1974. And that predominantly was focusing on bacteriological pathogenic contamination. So viruses, parasites, things like that. Creepy crawly bugs in the water that we wanted to try to kill. A handful of other contaminants, but it really grew in 1996 to be really widespread regulations with respect to water quality to become what we call now source to tap. So the water system is regulated from the water in its source up on the mountains until when it comes out of your tap and every step in between. Okay. And the way they really do this is what's called a multi-barrier approach. This is a three-pronged approach or a three-legged stool. And those three prongs are source water protection, which is one of the big reasons we're here to talk tonight, treatment, and distribution system integrity. If you cut one of the legs off the stool, you're either going to fall or get really rickety. And in order to get your stability back, you really got to beef up the other couple and try to put things back in place. It's a lot cheaper, a lot easier to protect the source than it is to treat the water once it gets contaminated. Treatment is not easy, as the operators here will tell you. Treatment is expensive. Treatment doesn't go away. If your contamination happens, that treatment doesn't go away. It most often don't get to turn that off. And then you could have the best water in the world, but if you put it through pipes like Swiss cheese, you're going to have problems. So that's the distribution integrity. That's what it keeps everything tight and keeps everything safe. So now drilling a bit into Vermont. So that's a lot of the federal stuff, and we parallel it in Vermont a little bit later, but we'll venture a little bit into our authority from the state perspective. A lot of words here. These slides are available. I'm not going to read this at everybody, but basically, state legislature gave us authority. So the secretary is the secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources under whom I work and I'm delegated authority. The secretary shall have authority over and shall regulate purity of drinking water, including blah, 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 public drinking water sources, public water source protection areas, and we may establish by rule things required for water quality. This is where we can have tighter standards. Construction, protection, testing, monitoring of public water sources, design, construction, installation, why our pipes are buried and don't freeze. Hopefully they don't freeze. Sorry to the operators. Then it's a bunch of other stuff, and it also gives us the authority to establish public water source protection areas. I'm going to talk about a little bit. Brad's going to get into that in much more detail. And then allows us to require methods to mitigate and prevent public health risks that could arise from source contamination. I'm just going to beat this drum. First and foremost, the purpose of this rule is protection of public health. That's why we're here. That's what this is the purpose of EFUD. That's why we're here. Secondary is to retain primacy. So what that means is when that federal rule converges, do we take it or do we let EPA do it? And by and large, we take it. So that's primacy. So that's us. So we take all the federal rules, all the state rules, and combine it into one sandwich, and that's what we implement when we regulate and inspect EFUD. So this is where I'm gonna start to kind of talk, not intentionally talk down to folks, but really try to give a little bit of a baseline. So we talk about a water source. What is a water source? What is a source of drinking water? And it can be one of several different things. It can be a spring, like in the top left. It could be a well, like in the top right. It could be a reservoir, like the bottom left. It could be a stream on the bottom right. There's also combinations and crisscrosses, and EFUD has all of these. So EFUD can use, which is really good. It's really great to have that redundancy and that backup. They have those options. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, Wells and springs, for the most part, are groundwater. So that's, like Skip said, water that's 30 years old that fell and took 30 years to work its way down through the dirt and the rocks. That's groundwater to pump it out. Surface water is what you think of. It's the reservoir, it's the streams, it's the Winooski. Those are all surface water bodies. Who remembers this? The rain cycle, the water cycle from whenever, right? From way back. So this is a bit of an oversimplification, but it also has an added layer here that we probably, I don't remember talking about in grade school with the whole water cycle. You remember the rain falls, it goes across, it goes to the lakes, it goes through evapotranspiration and it repeats, right? But it's not actually a closed loop. It doesn't always just repeat because this water percolates and infiltrates and goes down below ground. And as it does that, it can pick up things from the golf course, things from the rivers, things from the forest. Oftentimes, the nice thing with groundwater is that gets filtered out. Not always, but that can get filtered out. As opposed to precipitation from the golf course goes into the surface waters, into the stream and goes into the water body. Less protection, less steps there, less safeguards in place. All right. Surface water filtration is not easy. Filtering the water, Skip very, you just glance right over it, basically. Oh, yeah, we put it through the filters. I'm going to show you what the filters look like, talk a little bit about how that works, but surface water filtration is not easy. Surface water filtration is very complicated. It is very specific. The temperature of the water matters. The speed the water goes through everything matters. The clarity of the water matters, all of that. Really important. There are significant federal regulations, which we've adopted, that oversees the surface water treatment. Basically, within that is minimum disinfection requirements. The water has to be disinfected. That's why when you turn your water on, it tastes like chlorine. It has chlorine, that's necessary. It has to be filtered also. You're not just drinking the stream water, it's filtering out those solids and inorganics and things like that. And really, the main focusing of the filtration is to get rid of pathogens and bacteria and things like that. You know this without realizing, potentially. Anybody heard of backpackers diarrhea, beaver fever? You know when you're out riding or hiking or whatever, you don't just, no matter how clean the water looks, you don't necessarily take a drink without pumping or filtering or treating. Same thing here, but on a much bigger scale. Next, please. So this is what a filter looks like up the hill at the treatment plant. There's two of these, right? Yes. Operators, two of these. They're 8 to 10 feet wide, 14 plus feet tall, and 30 plus feet long. So like two of them would fit in this room. So this is why I say this is not easy. They basically apply this glue into the water. So the water comes in from the streams or from the one spring that is really subject to surface water infiltration. The water comes in and they apply basically a glue to make all the little pieces stick together to big pieces, because it's a lot easier to filter out big pieces than all the little pieces. So they apply basically this polymer, this glue, water comes in here, gets pushed up through this box, which has all these beads. They're like, look like little aspirin tablets, lots of surface area, lots of nooks and crannies, lots of bumps and things like that for the sticky, bigger pieces to accumulate. Water goes up into this trough, flows down into this trough, which is a little bit lower. And then the water goes into the filter bed through this anthracite and sand and gravel and garnet layers, basically from small to big by gravity. And when it's ready, and not until then, and when the filter can accommodate it, the water filters through and then goes out and comes down into town. This is significant. This is a lot of work. We require licensed operators to operate this. So the same way you can't drive an oversized truck on the highway without a license, you can't run one of these without a license either. So that's what the folks up the hill have. Next, please. So what do those filters do? They predominantly address turbidity. I'm hopeful the incoming water is never like this, so probably is once in a while. We want to go from water that's like this and work our way to here. Normal operating circumstances, that's not that hard to do. We saw in the last couple of summers, not to point fingers at Berry City, but it's a good local example. In the storms in 23 and 24, the water was coming through the watershed so fast and so hard, it was bringing so much dirt and silt and sediment with it, they couldn't filter it. It was overwhelming the filters and they just would break through and go into towns. The entire city of Barry was on a boil water order twice in the last couple summers because they could not remove this stuff. And if you can't remove that stuff, you know the creepy crawlies are getting through, right? So the water system operators do a really good job at taking water from here and bringing it to there. Next, please. But that's not it. That's not enough. Need to have disinfection. So this is an old graphic from when that cholera outbreak happened. That, you know, Death's Dispensary is just drinking water. So Life magazine, I don't know why they get credit. Well, they get credit because they said it. I don't know why we point to it because it's Life magazine. It's kind of like pointing to Wikipedia these days, but they cited filtration of drinking water, use of chlorine is probably the most significant advance in public health in the millennium. I'll buy it. I will agree. Disinfection is critical. Disinfection is necessary. Without disinfection, you wouldn't have drinking water in this town. And so this is like the subheading or subtitle of this is, why does my water smell like bleach? This is why you need that disinfection, because you need, once all the solids are removed and everything else, you need that disinfection to kill the bacteria, the parasites, the pathogens, things like that, that are in the water that are expected to come through the watershed. Okay, next slide. But you can have too much of a good thing. Too much disinfection creates other issues. So there's this balance called simultaneous compliance. You can't just blast as much chlorine into the water unfettered without problems and potential fallout and repercussions. And that comes by way of disinfection byproducts. You can't see it exactly, but there are contaminants in both of those streams that you can't necessarily see, but you can kind of see if I point it out. So the water's clear, right? It's not like that murky example that was up here. The water's clear. But if you look at that rock, maybe it looks a little red, a little rusty. And if you look at this rock, maybe it looks a little yellow. That's what's called naturally occurring material. So basically what happens is things in the watershed combine and wash and flush down into the streams and then literally brew like tea. So if you take tea on a very commercial scale and run it through that filter, you're going to get tea on the other side of that filter. It's like trying to put coffee through a Brita filter. You're going to end up with coffee on the other end, right? So this stuff is called naturally occurring material that can happen in the watersheds, especially as things are developed, especially as runoff is increased. We will see increased naturally occurring material, which when put in combination with chlorine and disinfectants creates disinfection byproducts, which are cancerous. Those are carcinogens. So this is that delicate balance of needing to maintain adequate disinfection without overdoing it to spike the disinfection byproducts and trade one risk for another. Next, please. Just a quick graph over the last several years with respect to disinfectant byproduct violations. We haven't issued all the violations for 2025 yet, but 2023 violations, 2025 violations, that's not coincidence with the big storms and big floods. We are seeing increased DBPs across the state, especially in the Lake Champlain area, which is just receiving all of that water really quick, all of those precursors really quickly. So we're seeing increased disinfection byproducts. I guess maybe not surprisingly, when there's less water, like there was in the record drought, there's probably less DBPs. Not how you want to solve your DBP problem, is you need the water, but we are seeing lower DBP violations in this past year. Okay, next. All right, source protection. I'm going to talk about this a little bit and hopefully not step too much on Brad's toes. This is the source protection area for the waterworks. These are the two streams. Those bullseye circles right there are the two streams. Those are what we call zone 1. And then zone 2 is here. And that's the greater drainage area that ends up feeding those streams. Next, please. So if you think about sources of contamination, you think about this is the water table, and that's a stream. If that stream was your drinking water source, its potential for surface water flow to carry whatever from the farm, whatever from the house and the landfill and whatever else into the stream. And that can happen pretty quickly. And that's why we use distance and we use management as a precaution and as a barrier, because there's no physical barrier. I mean, you're not going to build a wall here to stop the water from getting in because you need the water to get in because that's your drinking water, right? So the way to prevent potential contamination is management. It's a little different with respect to groundwater. So these wells that are here, we don't want to site a well immediately down aquifer of a agricultural thing. So we would work on that. We have regulations for that. But this gets into the many different small pieces of contamination that can get into the system. And this is where I think it was Benjamin Franklin at least is cited with saying, you know, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So an ounce of prevention here to change the land use, manage the land use is worth a lot more and is a lot more beneficial than allowing it to go into the stream and then trying to treat it after the fact. Next, please. So these are just the regs with respect to source water protection. I'm not going to go through this, but basically the system needs to own and manage the zone that's within 200 feet around the sources. And they're responsible for management and assessment and emergency planning and risk mitigation and understanding what the potential sources are in the much greater areas. So that's the inventory and assessment of those sources. Next, please. So this is that same source protection area just pulled out and identifying the three different radii. Look at that. The three different radii that we use, the three different zones. So zone 1 is that 200-foot zone. Within that 200-foot zone, if a drop of something falls, we expect it to go into the well. We expect it to go into the source. So contamination within that zone is immediate and certain. That zone 2 pulled back, that's within 200 feet of a surface water body, so the streams coming through, we would say that contamination is probable. So if something that happens up here, it's most likely going to make its way down the stream. And then zone 3 is basically everything else that could be part of the watershed. And then potential impacts from those sources are possible. Again, this is where management is really important for this because you don't have the percolation, the physical barriers. Next, please.
Well, that's it.
That's it. So, right. That's it for me. Any questions about public drinking water systems, regulations, stuff like that? Oh, I'm sorry.
No,
I assume
no, that's good. You can self-moderate. That's awesome.
If you ask my wife, she would say otherwise.
Yeah, please.
I'm just curious if this is also being done, obviously, there's a lot of mountain runoff that comes off the stove. And I'm just wondering from, you know, from Platinum, all those areas that flow into the reservoir. I assume that that's also being looked at the same way, or is that not?
Not by us. I mean, the reservoir is not the source of water for drinking water. So that's just, that's my colleagues and the rivers and streams and the lakes and ponds folks about the team, well, it's the Lake Champlain TMDL, but there's other regs about development and stormwater and things like that that handle that.
Yeah, please.
Can you please go back to the slide with the source protection area map?
Tom,
And I just have a question about like, to orient myself, where's Mount Hunger's?
Brad's got a ton on this.
We'll dive into that ad nauseam. Well, feel free to ask the question now. It's not on this, it's on my presentation, it will be next, but if you have a question for him, feel free.
Is it within the yellow area?
Is what with it?
The
Sorry.
summit?
The summit?
Yeah.
The summer.
Just to give myself a sense of
So
scale.
the ridge is, it's up through here, right?
Right.
The ridge is right about here. So this is the high point. So then, yeah, I mean, that whole face is what drains.
Any questions from the board members? It's rare you get the lead regulator.
Yeah, no, we have his phone number. That's very helpful.
Have there been any turbidity studies specifically on these two streets as of yet? To kind of speak to the impacts that have happened with multiple persons.
So the operators want to talk about how turbidity is regulated and monitored?
How it's regulated.
Yeah, what do you do with respect to
As far
keeping
as
an eye on it?
what studies we have, I'm not sure that there has, to be fair, I've only been here 3 years, so it's not an excuse, but I'm not sure that I'm not aware of the study.
So what happens when we have a bad storm and you've got chocolate milk in Miriam Brook and Tyler Brooks? What happens at the plant?
Okay, so that's easier to, so, okay, again, high rainfalls that we had last summer, not the same drought we had this year. We are fortunate enough here in Waterbury, we do have the option between surface and groundwater. So once we get a turbidity above we're getting really technical, it's 0.8, 0.9 parts per million, it kind of shuts us down as far as surface water goes. Then we have to switch over to groundwater. There's a lot of groundwater over the last few years, between too much water and not enough water. You can look back through the data over the years and see if turbidity has risen, but I can't give you specific numbers.
So they have monitors on the turbidity 24/7. And they report and spit out, and it flags highs and lows and averages and all that, and they report that to us. That's public information. We have it on our website. If you want to take a look at it, it's really specific, and it's just a PDF. It doesn't have trends, but that is we use turbidity as the surrogate for adequate filtration for removal of everything else, because like I said, if they're removing down to very, 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 very low turbidity, the expectation is they're filtering out the bigger pathogens and the bigger cysts and the bigger things like that. So they do have extensive turbidity data, whether that's been crunched or that's more crap, it's high this morning, let's go type data than it is things are increasingly worse throughout the whatever.
I would just add too, because I think your question was getting more at in the streams themselves, if I understand it correctly. There's not monitoring that happens in the actual stream. So monitoring happens once that water's been removed from the stream and funneled down to the treatment plant. So when they're operating the treatment plant, number one, if they know a big storm is gonna roll through and make things really nasty and turbid, they'll shut that treatment plant down. So they don't track that data the entire time. And that's really kind of the gist of it. So they're not monitoring it. It's not like there's a number that gets recorded or a study that's been done recently right in the stream. They're keeping an eye on it and making sure they shut down before they pull all that dirty water and have a mile or two of pipe full of muddy, dirty water that they have to deal with. So there's not a long-term data set from right in the stream, but they do monitor it right at the treatment plant.
I'll get to your question just in a second, but I wanted to go back to your question earlier. You were asking a question about where the sampling and monitoring happens, as I understood your question. I wonder, Ben, if you could talk about what are the points of compliance at which you as regulators are looking at to make sure that the system is compliant?
So those, the 90 plus chemicals that are contaminants that are regulated basically what we call entry points. So that's at the very first point where somebody could drink the water as a customer, which is for most instances is the water plant itself is its own customer. They bring water back in so they can have water. So that is where that's the point of compliance for all of the source water things, the disinfectant requirements. The lead and copper and total coliform bacteria are indicators of distribution, so those are in the distribution system. So there's an entry point, there's two entry points. There's all the water here and the surface water combines and goes to the surface water plant, and all the water here for the wells combined, and that's one entry point, and then the sources are the other entry point. The surface water sources is another entry point. So those are both monitored very heavily.
And I assume, without knowing this for certain, that if you saw a problem at the water plant where you were testing or further down the distribution system, that you might require the district or the district might want to do it for themselves, go further up and figure out what the source is of that.
Yeah. And this isn't one and done. This sampling is, like I said, continuous for some of these things, daily for others, weekly, monthly, every 4 months, every 6 months, every year, every 3 years, every 9 years. All of this is just, it's based on the risk. It's based on the actual contaminant. So if they have a history of something, we want to keep that on a watch list. We want to pay attention to that more so they would increase the sampling frequency for those specific things. And yeah, David's right, especially with multiple sources and multiple different potential pathways. We would definitely drill into, look at one brook versus the other, look at one well versus the other spring and try to identify potential sources and causes.
Yeah, you had a question.
So it seems like the rub for this conversation is, I mean, I don't think anybody's arguing that the water should be protected. I mean, I think the question is, what is the science behind certain types of activities that pose a threat? For example, we have a camp on Lake Champlain and we're in the Grand Isle Fire District number 4. Our water comes straight out of the lake, gets treated. We don't say, well, nobody can use the lake, or nobody can use the lake within X number of feet from the intake pipe. So, I mean, clearly there's got to be some science around what levels of risk are allowed. And it seems like that's the conversation. I assume we're going to get to it at some point, but that's kind of the conversation we're going to have around this whole issue, right?
So that's a conversation that the commission will certainly have, absolutely.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
not not tonight. I mean, this is a long process that we have ahead of us.
Yeah. But good, Ben, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I was just gonna punt to them. That's their decision, that's not my decision.
Well, am I right? Can I ask this question, both to the district and to you, Ben? My sense is there's different levels of treatment and different costs of treatment. So, I think there was a big battle with New York City some years ago in which New York City was asked to install a like multi-billion-dollar treatment system.
Brilliant, yeah.
Multi-trillion-dollar system, and they ended up using source water protection as an alternative.
It's a little different. So New York City does not filter its water the way EFUD and basically there is no avoidance of filtration in Vermont. New York City owns the Catskills. That's how they control the turbidity. That's how they can control what goes into their source water. So it's a slightly different approach, but that is, it's just not on a scale it's not applicable.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to compare this to New York City for sure, but the cost, right? There's, as you increase treatment, there's a cost issue. So that's something that this group you're also responsible for managing, right?
Right. And even with us having groundwater sources and surface water sources, our surface water sources are all by gravity. But groundwater, we have to pump, and there's a cost to that. So we're constantly doing this.
One way to look at this, one way I look at it, I come from a background in electric utility regulation. And under Vermont law, one of the things we do is long-term planning for our electric system. And the planning has a constraint, an objective constraint. How can we serve demand, current and future demand for service at the lowest long-term cost, total cost to society over the planning horizon? And the planning horizon can be anywhere from 20 to 50 or more years. By long-term cost, we mean all of the costs, both direct and environmental. This is again in the electric utility system world that we live in here in Vermont. I see what EFUD does in much the same light. So what we will ask ourselves, amongst other things, amongst the questions that you all asking, is how can we meet our long-term demand for service at the lowest long-run cost? And that will have impacts on how the land gets used or not used. And those are all questions that we want to give long and deliberate thought to. And this is, in my view, this is just the start of that process.
Yeah, so ratifying your question, I think this is, you've asked exactly the kind of question, how do you balance the various issues, cost, recreation, public health and safety, which is the overarching concern. In the very back, you had a question. And then Bill.
Yeah, I appreciate the information, very informative. You mentioned the Barry, what happened in Barry, with the turbidity of their water. And I know you guys, it sounds like you can basically control whether it's groundwater or whether it's well water that we are taking in. Is that the reason that he didn't have the same issues?
Yeah, Barry doesn't have the backup. Barry has a single source for their reservoir. That's their only option.
Okay. And so as of right now, like I think earlier, like there's been no contamination that's been measured at this point. So out of an abundance of caution, based on some activity that happened recently, but decided to close this off to recreation, right?
I think that's a fair summary. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and it goes to what Ben was talking about, the different barriers of protection. And one of the barriers in a surface water source protection system is making sure that human activity isn't causing contamination.
Sure. And just finally, like talking about the logging that happened in the 50s and the 90s, might there be a time where we're going to go in there and log again?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the logging was done as a way of managing the watershed, and that's a very common method in watersheds.
Yeah, but presumably, right? I think embedded in the question is, and there might be contamination associated with that you'd have to pay attention to as well, which, right? So fair point.
The impacts of doing that type of activity versus having it open to non-mechanized recreation.
Right.
Yeah.
Point taken. Bill.
Yeah, so Skip alluded to the fact that, he and I started at the same time in 1988. And the water project and the treatment plant really was about 1991 to 1993. You alluded to the Clean Water Act. So up in the system, which is downstream from the well field and downstream from the two dams, the water runs through what was our old treatment plant, up right on the Stowe line up on Barnes Hill. It's a settling basin today, basically. The water still runs through that. There's a small, I don't know how many gallons, but it's not as big as half of this room. The water runs in there, and then it runs from there down to the treatment plant. And a lot of the turbidity falls out in that settling basin. But before 1990, when the treatment plant opened, that was the treatment plant. And there was a micro screen in there. It was a big drum, and it kind of spun around, and the water came in, and it hit the screen on that drum, and it knocked leaves and sticks off. And then it went downstream. It was chlorinated there, and then you drank it. And the Giardia cysts weren't getting filtered out by that micro screen. It was just the organic material, basically. Most of the turbidity stayed there. We have a really excellent source of water. This, I don't know where Barry's water source is, but this is on the side of the mountain. There's no houses up there. There's no farms up there. It's forest land. When we hired Dufresne Henry to build the treatment plant, they had to do a pilot test. And I don't know if you were working for the state back then, but the pilot test, they were supposed to, and I'm not an engineer or mathematician, but they were supposed to show a 2-log reduction in their turbidity, that they could reduce the turbidity by a 2-log measurement. The water was so clean, no turbidity in it, that they could not meet that standard. And it was like, we fought with the, Farmers Home Administration, the federal government, the state, about, well, you're giving us a hard time because the water isn't dirty enough. So I think part of the problem, or part of the reality that these folks face is those 10 miles of mountain bike trails were not there in 1990 when that plant was built. And now you've got crossings, you've got trails that run right beside the brook, and it stirs up the ground. And there's not a lot of vegetation in the forested area, but it loosens the soil, and that goes into the stream. And just like any other contaminant, when it comes to drinking water, I think turbidity would be considered a form of a contaminant. It costs money to get that out. The filters clog up faster. I mean, when you showed how the filtration system worked, you didn't talk about backflow and backflushing. But, if there's no turbidity in the water, you don't have to run the backflow pump as often as you do when it's very turbid. And that's electricity. It sends water out of the system. We bring it back. We try to recycle that water. But turbidity is something that costs to get out of the water. And if you don't have it in there, you don't have to treat it to get it out as much.
And thanks, Phil. Yeah, anyone else? Get in the back.
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
Do we have data that shows an increase in turbidity since 1990 and the development of this system?
Does anyone know? It sounded like there's not a collection of water quality in the streams, so I'm not sure that they have that data. Has anyone collected that?
We have lots of records that we could go through. We would really have to drill down into the records all the way back. I just have not done that.
Oh, so you may have some records. Okay, yeah, thanks.
Even if there is an increase in turbidity borne out in that data, is there a clear causation from the trails on land, or is it possible that this is due to higher rain events or climate change? not sure. I think this is correlation and not.
Causation, yeah. I've got a cartoon up on my bulletin board, says, you know, people who confuse causation and correlation all die. So, yeah, good. It's a good point. And I think I think the group, is interested in looking at data like that. So it's a good question. And there may need to be some further study and analysis to answer that question. And one other thing that I know is on the agenda for future meetings is to talk to other communities that have had to deal with similar issues, that run similar municipal systems that rely on surface water. So this group can learn from what their experience has been.
That's our plan for the next meeting, which, as I mentioned earlier, is unlikely to be in January. Stay tuned, check our website, and we'll be posting on Front Porch Forum.
Yeah, thank you. In the back, please.
If you're looking at data collection points, I'd be curious what percentage of the 10-mile trails fall within that 200 feet you were saying is like the recommended distance?
Yeah, that's a question we have too.
Yep.
Good question. I don't know if you heard it, but Cindy said, yes, we have the same question. Yes, please.
One other data point that I would love to know about too, are we looking at any other watersheds either around the state and or across the country that have also dealt with use such as this? And are we reaching?
Well, that's what we want to take a look at in our next meeting. We want to talk to other, as David said, we're contacting folks both in the state and elsewhere who may be able to shed some light on, their experience will help shed some light on the possible approaches.
Didn't you say that the 200 feet is an absolute, and that's an exclusion zone, but it's not just 200 feet from the stream that could cause problems. You could be 400 feet away from the stream, and if you're on a hillside that's, a big slope and you stir it all up, it rains, it's going to blow it. So it's not just 200 feet.
Yeah, it's the certainty, the probable, the possible. And then, yes, extreme weather changes all that. It short circuits the whole system.
Yeah, well, why don't we let Brad come up unless there's any other.
One question.
Oh, yeah, thanks. Go ahead, Jenny.
Thank you. I had a question about your source protection map. Does that comprise the entirety of the waterworks property? Because my understanding was that on the northern part of the property that actually there was no downstream flow into the water collection areas.
I've got a map that will come up that shows the source protection area and the EFUD property highlighted specifically. So that will be coming up, but the answer is yes, there is part of the EFUD property that is not within the designated source protection area. Sorry to butt in.
Yeah, no, great. I'm glad you did. So Jenny, that was Brad, if you couldn't see him. And it sounds like you'll have a chance to look at some other maps in a moment. So why don't we, why don't we thank Ben and
Thanks, Ben.
ask Brad.
Clicker.
Brad, is yours this guy?
Yes, and if you don't mind hitting the presenter button, is that possible?
Okay.
Or is that gonna throw you out? They might have just broke the projector.
Can they see it online?
Yeah, I think they should be able to see it online.
How's that? No?
Fine for me.
Folks online, can you see that slideshow?
I gotta share the screen again.
Oh.
Where would we be with that?
We'd be right there with an overhead.
Folks online, can you see a slide that says managing public water system watersheds?
Perfect. All right, let's see if this thing will work now. Again. Get it, click forward.
Tommy may have to do it.
Yeah.
All right, there's a lot of clicking. I don't know if there's a mouse that I can just hold and click. Is that gonna mess you up?
Give it a shot.
Stuff comes in kind of one at a time. So that's the only way I can keep it all straight in my head. So my name's Brad Roy. For those who don't know me, I know I recognize a lot of faces in the room. I'm going to start out by saying thank you for being here. I work for Vermont Rural Water Association. I work with water systems every day. And honestly, not a lot of people think about their water. So just to have you out here tonight on a cold night when you could be next to a wood stove is a pretty impressive thing. So like I said, I work for Vermont Rural Water Association as a source water specialist. I'm a former water and wastewater operator and highway department and rec department and a little bit of everything for the town of Waterbury and for the Farrar Utility District. I have a wildlife and fisheries biology degree from UVM, and I grew up right on the foothills of this area. So I'm very familiar with it, used it for a long time. Quick about Vermont Rural Water Association, we won't dwell too much on it, but our main mission is to promote public health and environmental protection through technical assistance, education for drinking and wastewater systems. So we work with systems all over the state. We do this stuff every day in a capacity involving anything to do with water and wastewater. There's a little bit of our background I won't dwell on, and then sort of the structure of us, but the important part is I'm down there on the bottom. I'm actually funded through the USDA Farm Service Agency, where my funding to do this kind of stuff comes from. So I don't work for the state of Vermont. We get that a lot. We're completely independent from the state. We work with the state. So we'll set up a little framework, and I have to thank my previous presenters because a lot of my slides we can burn through a little quicker because a lot of this stuff will now be redundant, but hopefully if you see it come up again, you'll know that that's probably a pretty important thing to keep in mind. Drinking water in Vermont altogether, we've got more than 1,400 designated public water systems. A lot of people don't realize that. They range in size all the way from Champlain Water District down to Bloomfield, Vermont, 18 service connections, and Farrar Utility District falls somewhere in the middle of that. As Ben got to, you know, they can have surface water, groundwater wells, groundwater under direct influence, all these different things, and EFUD is really fortunate to have all 4 of those. That is an anomaly. That doesn't happen very often, and that's really an incredible thing that you guys have at your disposal. Public drinking water is strictly regulated. You know, we've kind of dove into that a little bit already, but there's a ton of regulations that go into this stuff. So as we start talking about source water more specifically, every system treats it a little bit differently. And there's a few factors that they really focus on, or a few factors that really define how they're going to approach source water protection. A big one is financial capacity. Some systems have no money to spend on source water protection, despite the fact that we know that money spent on source water protection is benefited multiple times over when you get down towards the treatment side of things. So if you can spend the money on the front end and protect the source, it's going to save you a lot of money downstream. Things like the topography, the geology of the land, what's happening on that land. Is there buildings? Is it urban? Is it forested? Are there recreational uses? Is there a historical precedent, which is sort of what we're working on right now, a long-term time frame where people have used it a certain way, and then you're looking on changing that potentially or potentially not. Is there existing contamination issues? You know, is there things there that we know about already that we need to be concerned with? And then public input, which in this situation, we're here to have not as much public input tonight, but over the course of time, it sounds like there'll be plenty of opportunity for that, which is a great thing because a lot of people in this room probably drink the water. I think I got too far away to click. Oh, there we go. So Ben dove into a lot of the regulatory stuff, but essentially, I guess it's not going to click for me.
Just wave it at us. We'll
yeah, keep clicking. Okay, so the water supply rule is sort of what I'm going to focus in on because that's, as an operator and a source protection specialist, the Bible of the regulations for us. 3 things that we get from that water supply rule that are really important to remember is the definition of a public water source, which we've kind of gotten to already. A source protection area, which again, we've gotten to already, surface and subsurface area from or through which contaminants are reasonably likely to reach a public water system source. And then lastly, an important designation that the source protection area shall be delineated for a water system. So shall meaning it's not an option, it has to happen. So we have that source protection area, and that's what we're going to talk about from my perspective a little bit more. The other important thing is that a source protection plan shall be developed which mitigates risk associated with existing and potential sources of contamination. So by law, we have to be addressing potential sources of contamination, not just contamination that we know about or see. Move on. Suppose I can give you this back if I'm gonna have you click. So if you want to click through and just bring the whole slide up and get everything in there, I just want to, right there's good, differentiate a little bit between a watershed and a source protection area. Again, this stuff will be online, so I won't read the entire slide to you, but a watershed is any land area where all the surface water drains to a common point. So you've got a watershed for the Thatcher Brook headwaters. You've also got a watershed for Lake Champlain. Those are different sizes and they function differently, and we talk about them a little differently. A source protection area is much more specific. It's that legally defined zone that we're talking about for a public drinking water source. It's going to typically be much smaller because we're not encompassing half of the state of Vermont in this case. We're just looking at where water could flow through and eventually get to our drinking water source at this specific location. And the purpose is to protect drinking water quality. So think the area of land where bad stuff is likely to travel to your public water supply. This is Edward Farrar Utility District water, by the way. We can go to the next slide. So we'll dive a little deeper. So getting back at that question, monthly water use by source type. So going back to 2023, this is a way to visualize how much water is coming from the different sources. In this case, down in the bottom is our surface water, which is going to be those streams. And then on the top in the green bars is going to be our groundwater, which is the expensive water, the water we have to pump out of the ground and use a lot of electricity. Surface water requires a lot of money to treat as well. That groundwater is important because it also costs a lot of money. So if you're not able to use your surface water sources, you're now relying on pumping that water supply hundreds of feet out of the ground, which becomes really expensive. I know this is probably a very antiquated number, but something like $1,000 a day was always put out there to pump the water supply that's needed for this utility district when you're using those groundwater wells. When you're on surface water, it flows down the hill completely free. So something to keep in mind. We could go to the next slide, which just shows it a little different. And if you click a handful of times, you'll actually be able to see, that's one more click. So over the years, what percentage was groundwater and what percentage was surface water that the utility district has used? This varies a ton. And part of the reason, there's a number of reasons for that. One is climate, like we've talked about. When you get these big rain events, you can't use the surface water sources, they're too turbid. Another one is the incredible ability to use groundwater as a backup. So when the filtration plant needs service, when the SCADA system that runs it is down, when pumps need servicing, when the filters need media replacement, you don't have to worry about it that much because you just turn on those groundwater pumps. So this isn't necessarily 100% reflective of environmental conditions. It's reflective of environmental conditions and changes that have to happen when you have new treatment plant operators that aren't as familiar with the surface water filtration. You might lean on groundwater because it's a simpler process. But just to give you an idea of where the water's coming from. Next slide. So we'll get into some maps here. This is the groundwater source protection area. There's a specific groundwater one and a specific surface water one. You can see some of those points that we were talking about before. These are your sweet wells down here. You've got a various number of springs, and then these are going to be the two surface water intakes in the streams. The laser pointer might work on this too, so we'll try that. And if you click, I think 2 more times. So you can see the Tyler Brook obviously flowing into that intake, and then the Merriam Brook into that intake. We'll go to the next slide. This is going to be the surface water source protection area. So it's a little bit differently shaped based on all those things that were mentioned, hydrology, geology, that kind of thing. You can see that it doesn't include these groundwater sources, obviously, but it does. It extends well up to basically the pinnacle of this mountain range here up in the Worcesters. Comes all the way down into Middlesex. So it's a huge area, right? This is a massive area that has the potential to contaminate the drinking water supply. So that's a big concern, and it's something that statutorily, the system is responsible to take into consideration and plan for and mitigate risk in. And that's not just the area that they own, that's the entire source protection area when I say that. Next slide. So here's combined. This kind of gives you a good overview of everything. You can see that's Waterworks Road right down here. All the headwater streams and everything like that, and then the brooks. Next slide. So this one I think is really important to look at and understand. So this highlighted area, that's the Sweet Well field. That's the area, the parcel that EFUD actually owns. I think you're gonna click one more time for me. So about 500 acres of this source protection area is under direct control of the utility district. And that's important because like we say, that 200-foot isolation zone is, nothing should be happening in there besides things that are related to the water system. But it's a gradient, right? As you get further away, the likelihood decreases. And all your sources are down here. And EFUD is fortunate to own as much as they do, but they still don't control all of this. So making sure that they control this properly and mitigate risk to the highest extent possible is really critical to make sure that that water system maintains cleanliness and isn't contaminated in perpetuity. We're not just talking about a 30-year plan or a 50-year plan. We're talking about forever. So that needs to be taken into consideration when we have these discussions as well. And that's less than 20% of the total source protection area that's actually owned by the utility, which is higher than a lot of places. So that's not a terrible amount. Next slide. This is a little bit of water supply rule stuff. We'll skip over that because I think we already covered the isolation zone. Click once more. This is kind of the most important thing here. So in that rule, there are permitted and prohibited land uses. So the permitted, or as you can see here, and the prohibited is this long list here. But down at the bottom, any other activity which may contaminate the water source. So may is important there because it's not will, it's not we know for a fact, it's that you are responsible to mitigate anything that might potentially contaminate that water source. So that's what they're charged with making sure happens, and that's sort of part of the lead into this meeting tonight is they're trying to fulfill that requirement of the water supply rule. Next slide. So this is just the specific 200-foot isolation zone. Doesn't include the Sweet Wells, which would be down there, but it does include the 2 surface water intakes. So of that 2,450 acre source protection area, that isolation zone is only about 20 acres. So that's something to keep in mind, that in the grand scheme of things, the main part that we're the most concerned about is really pretty small. These are the actual, the critical areas, but contamination can come from a much bigger area than that. But just to give you an idea of what those isolation zones look like. I know this says Thatcher Brook, but that'd be Tyler and that would be Marion. Next slide.
Right,
Please.
what's in the purple circle, just so they know?
Yeah, that's a great point. So the purple is going to be groundwater sources, and then the yellow is going to be surface water sources.
So springs.
So springs, or technically I don't know, would a weedy come up as surface or groundwater? Surface. Surface, that's kind of semantics, but yeah. Next slide. So we'll get into some of the challenges and why we're here tonight. Next slide. Oh, let's go back one. So this was sort of, making the case on why we showed up here. We know the trails were closed. We all saw the front porch forum posts that announced it. Some of the drinking water supply area signs that went up. I think I put that sign up, so that's cool to see. Next slide. So this one I think is really important, and this was actually kind of eye-opening to me. So who's familiar with Strava? Anybody here familiar? Okay. So this is a heat map. So this is showing us the frequency of people that are using these trails, right? Using the app to track where they are. And you can see, I wish I could overlay it. I'm not that good at mapping, so I apologize. But this is the Waterworks Road. That's the little bump, and that's that little bump. So if that kind of sets you up to where you are, that's a tremendous amount of usage that's going right along where those sources are. I have not been able to get up there and ground truth where the trails go right alongside those sources, whether they're within that 200-foot zone or not. I have some pictures we'll take a look at, but just to give you an idea of, that's lit up like a Christmas tree, quite frankly. And that's a lot of usage in the heart of both the surface water and the groundwater source protection area, and quite likely within the 200-foot zones of all those water sources. So something to keep in mind, why this is such a concern and why it's being talked about. Go to the next slide. So the contaminants that I'm most concerned about in a forested watershed, which is what we're talking about, or a forested source protection area, probably would have been the better word. Turbidity, pathogens, PFAS and PFOA, and the unknown, because unknown is always scary, right? We'll take a look at all of those individually. So next slide. Click a couple times, we'll just bring it all up. The arrow right there will be the last click. There you go. That's turbidity. I think we all kind of have a good handle on that. There's a lengthy definition, but essentially it's the stuff in the water. We've talked a little bit about how it's removed. We have a chemical addition, we filter it after that. But the big point is that the higher the turbidity, the higher the treatment cost. I think it's also important to remember that Waterbury's plant, because the water has historically been so clean coming in, uses a very weak chemical because they don't need a strong acting coagulant or flocculant to bind that turbidity up before it gets filtered. Once you start seeing more flashiness in your turbidity, where it's not a scale of 1 to 3, it's a scale of 1 to 100, right? Then you have to start talking about having different chemicals that you're going to use for different levels of turbidity. It's going to increase the amount of pumps you have to have and maintenance costs. It's going to increase the amount of potentially operators you need to manage all that stuff. So having this narrow range of turbidity that historically the plant has had lets you use that 1992 technology with a really weak polymer and not spend a ton of money filtering out something that looks like it came out of Dak Row when it's flooded. So something to keep in mind there. Next slide. Click a couple times. There you go. So pathogens. I was going to use a picture of my 3-year-old with a big snot bubble coming out of his nose, but I didn't want him to be posted on the internet for everybody. So we went with this slide. So I live in a house of pathogens, and I'm very familiar with them. Bacterium, virus, other microorganism that can cause disease. Big concerns are human waste, pet waste. Obviously, those are a direct conduit for pathogens to go anywhere. Stormwater runoff can be a big concern, trash. Some are difficult to remove from water, and some can be resistant to chlorine disinfection. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but important to know is that when filters are performing poorly, which happens when you have excess turbidity in particular, the likelihood of the risk of pathogens passing through that filter goes up dramatically. So that's something that as a treatment plant operator, you have to be aware of. If you have higher turbidity, there's a much higher likelihood that those pathogens could get through that filter. And that's not something that we want to see. Next slide. Click 2 more times for me. So if you take the width of a human hair, which is about 100 micrometers or 0.0039 inches, some of the pathogens we're talking about, Giardia, is about 1/7 that width. So that's a pretty small thing to have to filter out. What I worry about even more is Cryptosporidium. That's about 1/17 the width of a human hair. So if you start thinking about particles in water that you're trying to filter out, and you've got something that's that small, 6 micrometers, they can bind up and they can hide inside of those little particulates, and that could potentially make it through the filter. Is that a big deal because we disinfect? Well, we'll go to the next slide. It is. They can resist disinfection. Cryptosporidium in particular has the potential. I won't go into the study. There's a million of them, but they can persist in a chlorinated environment, and that's a big concern because if they make it through a filter, sort of game over. They're probably going to get out to the distribution system unless that water gets disinfected for long enough. But the primary way that you want to see Cryptosporidium taken care of is to not have it in your surface water. Next slide. And then click a couple times. I'm making you do a lot of work tonight. Oh. So there's some of those findings, just specifically how long they can last and still be infectious. But they're very persistent, they're very small, they're highly infectious, can be resistant to disinfection, and they're not monitored through our standard drinking water monitoring process. And I don't think a lot of people realize this. The way we regulate this stuff is through treatment techniques. So the Waterbury water plant is designed to remove all this stuff. But when you get new things added and those filters aren't working right, or something breaks, or there's an issue, they could persist and they could become dangerous to public health. So that's something that I worry about, and it's something that literally can keep an operator up at night, you know, making sure that that stuff doesn't happen. We'll go to the next slide. I apologize, there's a lot of slides.
How are you doing on time, Brad? Maybe another 5 minutes?
Yeah, we'll go as quick as we can. We're boiling down a 1,000-page textbook into 15 minutes. So PFAS and PFOA, anybody who's heard of that, it's been in the news a lot lately. Forever chemicals, something that we're incredibly concerned with. Found in a ton of outdoor gear that ends up on places like the Waterworks trails a lot. Seals, O-rings, coatings, lubricants, base wax treatments and waxes on skis, Gore-Tex jackets, all that stuff. These chemicals are dangerous. We only know of a few of them. We only regulate a few of them. There's tons and tons of them. So it's a big concern. There's plenty of water systems in the state that have issues with PFAS and PFOA. So something else to keep in mind. Click again. Quick example, certain parts of the country now, you can't even eat the wild game because there's such a high concentration of these forever chemicals that they've picked up from the environment. Go to the next slide. And then the last will be the unknown and emerging. This will be stuff that we don't know about, right? We're probably wearing, drinking, eating stuff every single day that is harming us in some way that we're not aware of yet. And the same thing is true for source protection areas. There's things being contributed up there that I guarantee we don't know about. Pharmaceuticals aren't regulated. When people urinate, when they're using the trails, those are being deposited into the ground. Microplastics, all these things that we know about, among others that we don't even know about yet. So all of those are concerns. The most effective measure to prevent them is isolation. It's kind of plain and simple. The farther away people are from that, the less likely it is to contaminate that. Move on. Those are a few, if you want to read it on your own time. Go to the next one. Many. So what's happening specifically? I hadn't seen a lot of these pictures, so let's click to the next one. Trash, right? Nobody wants an air conditioner in their drinking water. That's been happening in the waterworks since I've been involved with it. Class 4 road, people empty their truck beds, but that's a big concern. Also PFAS, want to talk about PFAS if you have Scotch Guard on your carpets. Next slide. It's a little hard to see, but erosion, right? So if you've got contaminants like cryptosporidium, they can, I don't know about crypto specifically, but different bacteria can persist in the soil. Once you have erosion from trail building that isn't done well and isn't, established and engineered and maintained properly, that stuff can get washed downstream and end up in your water sources. Next slide. Also increased turbidity. Talk about increasing turbidity. If you've got 10, 12-inch trees that are lining a stream bank and they get cut down to establish a new trail, all of a sudden you've lost a lot of your retaining power. Look at, any riverbank that doesn't have trees on it. It's probably going to start eroding when you get high water events. Next slide. Trail, stream, right? That one's pretty self-explanatory. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like this might have been one of the pictures that really was the impetus for this whole thing. Right?
Yeah, it was.
This is not okay. This is the stream that goes into the pipe that feeds the treatment plant. I don't think anybody wants to see that. Well, somebody did because they built it, but that person isn't thinking about drinking water when they're putting something like that in. Next slide. So some strategies, it's going to vary. It's going to vary by the stakeholders of the system, those people's values. It's going to vary by financial capability. If the decision was made to completely isolate the waterworks and put a 20-foot fence around the whole thing, that's great for source water protection, really expensive and terrible for recreation, right? So it's all a give and take. It's going to begin with discussions, among the board, among the treatment plant operators, in this case, among the public. And it's ultimately up to the owner of the land to decide how it's managed, right? This isn't the national forest. This is something very different as we talked about. So go to the next slide. You can click 3 times. So there's sort of 3 approaches. I think this is my last slide. I call it the fortress, the whatever, and the middle ground, right? And I think the middle ground is likely what most people end up doing. You know, you can go all the way from no public access, water system activities only, 0 recreational value in that. It's got the lowest chance of contamination, but it's also got the lowest risk to public health. You can take the whatever approach, I don't care, let anybody use it. You're gonna have the highest chance of contamination. You're gonna have treatment costs probably skyrocket because you're having more stuff to filter, or you're having to run those wells more to get the clean water down in the ground. You're probably gonna have unhappy users and overcrowding, because the tragedy of the commons, if you're not familiar with that story, look it up and read it, because I don't have time to talk about it. But when everyone has access to a shared resource and no regulation, typically things don't end well. And then you're probably gonna have source harm and destruction and the highest risk to public health. So, you know, we wanna see these things. We wanna see careful access considerations. We wanna see involved stakeholder groups, source water quality remaining priority in all of the decisions. Adaptive management techniques, you know, make it so that what you choose to do today, and when I say you, I mean EFUD, what they choose to do today can be changed. Science changes, things change, you know, times change. So you have to be able to be adaptive in this stuff. And then that the public health risks are accepted, because allowing any activity is going to create a public health risk. And everybody on that board has to be comfortable with the public health risk that they're allowing by allowing people on that land. One more click. Is that it? Yeah, we're done. We made it through. So that's my email. That's my phone number. Feel free. You can ask me questions. If you have other drinking water, public water system questions, call Rural Water. That's why we exist. You guys pay for it, so use us.
Thank you, Brad.
Yeah.
Well, questions from the district for Brad? Yes, Cindy.
So I know you go all over the state. This is probably an unfair question, but can you put a percentage on the number of public water systems that you see that have totally closed off access to their watershed?
Probably 0. Probably 0. To the watershed or to the entire source protection area, it's pretty rare that a system owns the entire source protection area, so they can't close it all down. I'm thinking of Bellows Falls specifically. They've got a lot of the surface water plants are coming out of Lake Champlain, or they have some sort of retention pond, whether it be the Orange Reservoir or the Menards Pond in Bellows Falls. To pull out of streams is something that I don't see as often. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you see it much less. So a lot of those places will regulate use on the water body and maybe surrounding, but they don't close it off completely. Typically walking around is fine. You know, wheeled vehicles, biking, e-bikes, that kind of thing, a little bit more hit or miss. Something like horseback riding, a little more hit or miss. So I would say
require diapers on the horses?
They don't. And you know, that's part of it, is I was in Bellows Falls working, and nobody can go on that pond, right? You can't paddle it, you can't swim it, you can't let your dog jump in it. But there's about 200 geese on that pond when I was there.
Yes.
So by limiting the hunting, they've now allowed geese, which are also a water quality concern. So this stuff all, you can look at it from a lot of different angles, but very few have the capability. They might very well shut the entire thing down to public users if they could, but they might not have the capability. I don't know if that's the case with all of them, but I very rarely, if ever, have seen one that's completely posted the entire way around and doesn't let anybody on the source protection area.
How about police powers?
As far as
like regulation, I
Yeah.
think that's what you mean. Like, you know, I think of the Catskill situation. New York City owns it. They allow uses, but it's heavily regulated. So,
Sure.
you know, what do you know about regulations of source protection areas?
Yeah, that's what spans the gap. I mean, I've been to a lot of systems. Some of them kind of take the whatever approach because it hasn't been an issue so far, so they don't worry about it. some of them, you know, Bellows Falls is a great example. They don't allow a lot of those uses, but the big thing to remember is you have to enforce that too, because a lot of these are rural. There's not a lot of people around in general, so you can put regulations in place, but somebody has to be there to enforce those regulations too. So a regulation without enforcement kind of doesn't tend to end up being a regulation. Does that answer your question, or did I
It does,
misunderstand?
it does.
Okay.
And I know everyone laughed about the horseback waste control, but Manchester, New Hampshire allows horseback riding in their source protection areas, but the horses have to have poop bags.
Oh, sure, just like a dog, yeah.
Yeah.
And pet waste is a big one. You know, we do a lot of down well camera inspections where we look down in wells because they're having coliform issues, and we can't directly say it, but there is a common thread between wellheads that have a lot of dog waste near them and wellheads that get coliform hits. So, you know, I'd advise to remember that just because something takes 30 years to get down into an aquifer and be pumped out of the ground, you may not worry about that much now, but someone 30 years from now is going to be worrying about that. So all these things, they impact groundwater too. Source water is just where we see it right on.
Other questions from the district?
The one pathogen you kept talking about,
cryptosporidium.
I confess ignorance of it. What is it? What sort of diseases does it cause?
Ben, can you answer that? Because I haven't taken my treatment test for a long time.
Cryptosporidiasis or whatever the heck it is. I mean, that's fever. It's
Okay.
extreme gastrointestinal problems, and it can be fatal in sensitive populations.
Giardia, I know about, and schistosomiasis, which
And
we don't see here, but yes.
Yeah, I've always said it different ways, but the oocysts, or however you would pronounce it, they're very persistent, and that's part of the problem. It's unlike some things where a few drops of chlorine can, you know, neutralize it or sterilize it. It doesn't work that way with crypto. So filtration is really the primary line of defense after source water protection. And that's why, you know, source water protection becomes so important in something like crypto specifically.
Does benzene kill it?
I don't know.
It might make it stronger and angry.
Yeah, it might be.
Questions from the group? I know we're getting to the end of our time here. Folks are running out of energy. Yeah, please.
You made a statement regarding PFAS and either being in materials or something along lines of being found a lot at the waterworks, either trail area. I'm curious if you can clarify if literally there's been measured PFAS there.
No, not measured. I mean, PFAS has been found everywhere in high concentrations. If you, to put it into perspective, I think this gives the best idea. When you take a PFAS sample, which we had the sample for at Waterbury, I did the sampling. It is so sensitive, and we're limited to such a small amount of that material in our drinking water. You can't have had a fast food wrapper in your hands that day. You can't be wearing Gore-Tex. You can't have anything non-stick. I think there was some limitations on what you can use to write on the sample bottle with.
No Sharpies, no Post-it notes, no sunscreen.
Yes, so all of those things contain more PFAS than the people that are running the water treatment facility are allowed to put downstream. So we know that PFAS historically was used in high amounts for things like ski waxes and Gore-Tex and Scotch Guard and those types of anti-oil, waterproofing, that kind of thing. So a lot of the stuff that PFAS was used very heavily for was outdoor gear and outdoor recreational gear. So that's why it's very fair to say that PFAS has been in the waterworks, because all that outdoor gear that's been used for generations was laden with it. And that's something that, again, might take 30 or 40 or 100 years to get down into the aquifer. But once it's there, it's a forever chemical. So it's there, and it's a big problem. We can chat with our neighboring friends or some ski areas about what PFAS can do to a water system.
In the back, and then Rick?
Yeah, I was gonna say that there's another source you didn't mention. It's just like rain, depositional atmosphere.
Sure.
And Vermont's got a pretty good data set of what shallow soil looks like, and PFAS are all over the place at significant concentrations that would impact groundwater, certainly surface water that's running through some of those soils.
Yeah,
So I think that should be acknowledged for sure.
Brad, how accurate is the testing for PFAS and PFOA? Because that would be, you said sensitive a moment ago.
Sure.
We're confident in how well the outputs of these tests.
Yeah, I'm gonna pawn it off to the person who regulates it, because I'm probably a better person to answer.
Yeah, so for something like PFOA, the health effects start at like 0.003 or 0.002 parts per trillion. So
Trillion with a
parts
T.
per trillion. So
Yeah.
the distance between here and the sun is 96 million miles. 1 part per trillion is 6 inches of the distance between the Earth and the sun. So we are talking unfathomably small levels. So that the health risks are at very, 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 very small levels. The lab that we send, the EFUD will send their samples to, can quantify around 2.0 parts per trillion. We have not seen it in the water here above 2 parts per trillion. So the confidence with that is very confident in those samples that we received.
Questions, comments?
Well, this has been terrific.
Yeah, please.
How much risk could you put a number or just a rough estimate on just people walking around in the woods? I'm not gonna put a number on it because it's so dependent on what that person's doing. You know, if they're at the halfway up the summit next to a stream and they need to defecate, that's a pretty high risk. I'd put a high number on that. If they're walking through where there's no trail and there's not a lot of people using it, so the overall impact is low, that's a really low risk. You know, another thing that I thought of, and again, this could be a week-long lecture, and thankfully for all of you, you don't have to sit through that, but with the drought we saw this summer, one of the big things I worry about with recreation is forest fires. And if you get a forest fire at the downslope side of a source protection area like EFUD has, and potentially wipe out a whole hillside, that does have a huge impact on a water system for years and years, destabilizing soils, killing trees, churning all that stuff up. So again, I'm just not comfortable putting a number on it. That's something that is really their charge, is to figure out what that risk would be. But I look at it more of the average person walking is going to be a lower risk or a lower impact than something with wheels. Something with wheels is going to be a lower impact than something with a motor, sort of that gradient. And that's the way I assess risk in a source protection area.
Can I ask a follow-up about, you asked the percentage of folks who completely block off their source protection areas?
Sure.
Could you give a similar percentage on how many folks are allowed to walk in a source protection, or how many source protection areas?
Sure. I've been to, and I haven't worked in the source protection area of one system that I believe legally follows the posting requirements for the state of Vermont, which is what it would take to completely isolate it lawfully. Criminals are going to break the law, but to legally do that, it would have to be legally posted. The only system, and I don't even know if it's all the way around, I know it's on the road frontage. That's the only system that I've seen that really doesn't allow walking in the whole source protection area. Typically walking is looked at as a pretty low impact, but again, that depends on the frequency of walkers. If it's a small system and they've got one well and there's 3 or 4 people that like to walk through there once a week, not a big deal. But if you've got a system that has thousands of people that are walking through there, walk down a muddy trail, and it gets exacerbated as more people go down there. So very few systems limit it to that degree that I've worked with personally. And I certainly haven't worked with all 1,400, but a lot more definitely limit, as the usage becomes more of a high impact, they limit that a lot more strictly, depending on the system.
Thanks.
Yeah, maybe one more question, and I want to turn us to kind of thinking about the next meeting and invite some input into that. Yeah.
Wasn't one of the permitted uses on that rural, like light duty road and playground and ball fields and?
Yeah.
So.
Yep.
It seems like an 18-inch wide trail might fall within that permitted use.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's opportunity in that last statement where anything that has the potential to impact the source. So there are permitted uses that aren't outwardly, you cannot do this, but you still can't do it if it has the potential to impact the source. And again, that's sort of what they're charged with figuring out, is what level of risk is comfortable, how much are you willing to risk the public's health to let people utilize that area? And that's something that is sort of up to the district to figure out.
But Fred, that rule, prohibitions and what's allowed was for source protection area, irrespective of whether it's surface water or groundwater. So, you know, a playground or a ball field on top of, you know, in a well field, maybe that's the wells, you know, the water table is a couple 100 feet deep, is very different than an 18-inch bike trail right next to a stream that's eroding.
Absolutely.
So, you know, you have to, it's respective of what the source is and where it is in the system and how close it is to contaminate your source.
For sure.
And that picture you showed of, and that may have been the worst one, but that clearly was not good.
Yeah.
So it's what the source is as well as what's allowed.
Yes, for sure.
It's a balance. So, Brad, thank you very much.
Thank you, Brad.
Yeah. So I think the last couple minutes here, what you all asked to do is we've already got some topics that you've identified. You're gonna have some public water supply systems operators that have similar kinds of systems, learn from them. You've got, I know Steve Hagenboo is on the list of people to talk, and that has to do, I think, with some of the ecological values of the system. There were some questions about monitoring, sampling, stream quality. It might make sense. That might be something to think about having addressed. Are there other things on your minds? And then I'll kind of open it up to other folks, to kind of other topics that people think are relevant to this discussion.
Well, we are interested in hearing from folks on how recreation can be planned and managed. Different types of recreational activities. That's clearly part of the equation. So we hope to have some speakers there. And we spoke with folks in Stowe and Waterbury. So, you know, we're being attentive there. And we certainly encourage any of you, if you've got thoughts of folks that we ought to be talking to, please get in touch with us. If I can say, Cindy and I are taking the lead for the commission on organizing these events. So feel free to write us directly, but also to anyone on the commission. Is that fair?
Great. So any other thoughts that you all have, questions you have that you think you'd like or you think that the commissioners should have in mind as they're deliberating? Yeah.
There is a very popular trail that runs along there. It's on the state land, so on the mountain trailhead. I just think it's important to consider that that's permissive, like the state is seeing that as permissible recreation. Additionally, the impacts of the felling of trees that occurred to block people from hiking on those trails, as well as other guards. I think there should be a consideration of how that impacted the area.
So you're saying that some people cut down trees to block the trails?
Yeah, I'm gonna say probably significantly more than any action.
Interesting. Are there, I assume you all must engage us from sometime with Forest Parks and Recreation and that sort of folks.
Yeah.
So that would be the group, right, that manage the Putnam Park and all that. So that maybe makes sense to have someone from that group engaged. Yes, please.
I hope we can consider, trail use from trail building. Maybe we can prosecute trail builders, and that's the way around this. I know JP had an issue with some folks did a huge gash down a popular backcountry destination. I don't think they got jail time. They were fined pretty heavily. They did get jail time. Yep, they did. So that's an enforcement action that I hope that we consider, because a lot of us love this land, love being able to use it. I like to walk it. I do ride my bike on it. If I couldn't ride my bike on it, I'd be sad, but it wouldn't be the end of the world. But would love to be able to take my little girl for a walk on those trails. I don't build trails. I don't cut down trees. There's a lot of folks like myself who just want to use the land respectfully. So we'd love an avenue for that, and hopefully we can prevent the. Exactly, yeah, totally on board with that.
If I could, just based on some prior discussions with this group, I'll share, that one of the, and I serve on my town's conservation commission. We have a town forest, so it's a similar kind of set of questions. If we decide we want all the dogs on leashes, it was an issue we had in our community. We had no ability to enforce that. So part of the reason this group has invited a community discussion of this is that if they do decide to allow some types of uses, they have finite amount of resources and time to manage that. It will be a community level effort. It'll have to require social, cultural engagement around that. So I appreciate your comment in that way. Yes, please.
I think there's two comments, so sorry. One, I think it's really important to understand the types of users that are actually out there using those trails. I think that there may be a disconnect between the amount of mountain bikers versus the amount of dog walkers and hikers and all that stuff. So really understanding the breakdown of the users would be really good to have. And I think also understanding how existing community partners can be a better resource for this, because there's so many people that want to help, that have the financial means to potentially help and want to make that difference. So making sure that that is a transparent conversation as well.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
You were talking about the enforcement, and I was wondering, maybe this isn't public information, but what is the status of the builders that were doing this without permission, and what's going on with those people? Who are they? Are they being held accountable or anything like that?
I mean, unless you know right now, it sounds like that might be another point of conversation.
Well, Woody has reported some of them, and the state police have visited them to let them know what's going on. So at least that's the extent I think that's occurred to date. That so. And we were careful, I think, when they tried to close trails, they didn't cut trees to do it. It was using down limbs and things. So.
Thanks, Kip. Great question. Yeah.
Well, I'd like to say that I moved to Waterbury Center in 87, and my wife and I have been using that as a playground, and we respect the land, and everybody I know who uses that land for hiking or biking really feels like they're more of a steward of the place than just taking advantage and raping the land, so to speak. My wife and I and our kids have created an awful lot of memories over those 30 some years, and I'd hate to see it close down so that other people can create the same kind of memories for their families.
Thank you. Thank you.
Back to what Rick just said, I'd also make two observations. The egregious picture of the trail right next to the water. There's a logging road just 20 feet over from that. And the other observation is, and there since the 50s. The other observation is they talk about pumping the water from the wells costing $1,000 a day. There's obviously an operational cost of running the filter for surface water. So there's a trade-off. And if recreation can benefit by a little higher amount of pumping, I mean, it seemed 2 of the years it was 44% was groundwater and 56% surface. The other one was the anomaly. I don't know. There's something to look at.
Yeah, appreciate that. We'll create a space for more conversation, more comments just like that. I know there's a variety of perspectives around those issues. But
part of the issue though is
Bill,
who pays for that?
What I don't want to do right now is have an argument, because I think we're just really trying to get information, and we'll have a chance to get the different perspectives out. The one thought I'll just share is in terms of the whether it's logging roads or the trails or where they're located, there should be a common set of understanding about what the kind of goals and the costs. And you flagged it, right? There's trade-offs in terms of costs. I think this group is trying to take a hard look at what those are. I think if it were as simple as let's just switch off and switch only to wells and then do whatever we want on the land, that's a choice for the community. This community is fortunate. It's very fortunate that it has the choice of protecting the source water and trying to figure out how to do that in a thoughtful way. Really proud to be in a state where a community is tackling this question. So, and in such a thoughtful way. So with that, I think we've reached the end of our discussion for tonight. Please look forward to more. I hope there will be, this is not the only forum. You've got Front Porch Forum, you've got a chance for interpersonal connections, and I don't know if you still, we don't have a post office in Montpelier anymore, but if you still have a post office, maybe you meet there at the transfer station.
And any comments, please put in the box.
Great, thank you all.